Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology, episode 65 with Kevin and Sarah Hale. What's going on, Sarah?
What's going on, Kevin? What's going on with you?
Not too much. It's pretty early in the morning.
It is. Yeah. Good morning, everybody, or whatever time of day it is. I hope you're having a fabulous day.
Good day. Good day.
Thank you for being here with us. Means so much.
Yeah. So we were finishing up, probably this is our last episode, talking about Dr. Newell's thesis, Repairing the World, Tikkun Olam, and Jürgen Moltmann's Theology of Hope. And this chapter focuses on, it's called The Theology of Hope and Tikkun Olam in the History of Christian Eschatology. So, eschatology. Yeah. It's, that means...
I hope that excites you even more than it excites us.
Yeah.
The word eschatology. Oh.
Yeah. It's basically the last things. It's the study of last things. And that includes, everything we know about apocalyptic literature, which is mostly Daniel and Revelation. Some of the prophets have a little bit of apocalyptic literature in them. And apocalyptic comes from a Greek word, basically apocalypse, which is in Revelation 1:1. And it means revealing or unveiling something that was previously hidden. So John is the author of Revelation, and Daniel's the author of Daniel, as we understand it. And so apocalyptic literature is different and unique, especially if you've read Revelation. There are many interpretations, and even now in the last decade, several books have come out. I think one of them is called Reading Revelation Responsibly, right? I mean, theologians are trying to help people, or biblical scholars are trying to help people, not get crazy with their interpretations of Revelation. And we'll get into, historically where things land, but in theological terms and eschatology, things seem to revolve around this concept of the millennium.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So, yes, you may be like us when you hear words like the book of Revelation and talking about eschatology, the study of last things, our ultimate destiny, right? Or words like apocalyptic literature, apocalypse. It just immediately you start feeling resistance or boredom or, right? I think it is because, partly at least, that a lot of us grew up in a time when the book of Revelation was being misused, it is a very strange book.
Yeah.
It's a very opaque, mysterious, maybe impossible / very difficult book to get your head around or to understand what in the world this book means to us. And it has been used in crazy ways, like Kevin said. And so coming to this last chapter of this thesis, it was like, oh, really? We have to talk about eschatology? I didn't see that coming.
Right.
But it ends up being a very interesting chapter with really application to us as vegan theologians.
Right.
Because Marcello starts out this chapter explaining why he decided to end his thesis with a chapter on eschatology.
Right.
And that is specifically because your view of end things or last things directly impacts how you treat the world.
Right.
Or how you believe we are to be treating the world.
Right.
So it has amazing, direct, obvious implications for a vegan theologian who's trying to say, we're supposed to be preserving and protecting and nurturing this world, this good creation, when you're going right up against people's theologies, people's eschatologies that say, no, we're not.
Right.
So.
Well, and I just want to say, too, being that we came from a dispensational school, we were so saturated with basically eschatology in a very... And most all dispensationalism is premillennial, and we'll get into that. But Sarah, from your point of view, I think for both of us, we had our own baggage around eschatology and premillennialism, and so reading this chapter interesting and informative, maybe harder for both of us to get through, not because it wasn't written well, but just because of our own baggage. And that's fine. But even, I just want to get your sense too, right? That at least in Bible college, it seemed like the men would get all riled up, right? In all these arguments, theological arguments.
You want to make this about gender right out of the gate?
No, yeah, we can. Well, I'll just edit this out.
No, you're so right. Yeah, we could get into the psychology of gender and why it seems like it's always the men. We've talked about this on the show before. Like, why is it that men love just sitting around and having these heated debates around these theoretical points, and they get so attached to their position, and they have their heroes in theology that they quote and would die defending. You don't ever really see women doing that.
Yeah.
You don't see women sitting around just enjoying the debate for the sake of debate and attaching their Christianity, their relationship to God to these. It's always been a fascinating thing to me. And it's something that, as our listeners probably know, has always made my eyes roll. And
right.
To me, it sucks the life out of what we're really doing here.
Right. And I think that's one of the things I want to say, that for the most part, if you've listened to this podcast, we avoid eschatology in terms of the minutia. We go right to what we call the eternal state. I was reading another book this week. One biblical scholar calls it the final age. We've used the word eschaton. My point is, we just get right to the end. And that's always my point. What is the end going to be? What are the values of the end? And we never really get tied up in all the minutia.
How we're going to get there.
How we're going to get there. But also, I'll just say this. Last night we went to a Lenten supper at our church, and the guy giving the teaching kept talking about going to heaven, going to heaven, going to heaven. And of course, I'm just thinking like, yes, this is everything we've talked about, that in popular theological understanding, most people think we're going to heaven. And yeah, we may be going to heaven, but like I like to say, in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be a pit stop. We are eventually going to the new earth, and that's where we will spend eternity. And so we just go right to that, and we don't get caught up in the minutia. And I just, one more comment, just worth saying, like hermeneutics. Many scholars would say that meaning is genre dependent. So the way you would read Revelation or Daniel, parts of Daniel, is different than the way you would read the Gospels or the way you would read the historical books or the narrative books, the Pentateuch. That's just something to keep in mind, that dispensationalists would say there's a consistent literal hermeneutic through the entire Bible. That's one of their main points, right? That dispensationalists would say there's a literal hermeneutic throughout, and that some of the passages apply to Israel and not to the church. And so we're not really going to get into that, but my point is that I think we would say that meaning is genre dependent now, is the way we would think of it. Anyway, that sets things up, right?
Does it? I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, like I said, it ended up being a very interesting chapter. Kevin has mentioned the word millennial or millennialism already, but to be completely honest, when I started reading this chapter, I couldn't have really defined that with confidence. Mm. So I was looking up a lot of words as we went through this chapter. But for anyone who, like me, isn't positive what that is, millennialism is a belief in a millennium, which is a 1,000-year reign of Christ. A 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, to me, it's important to point out that the whole doctrine around this 1,000-year period, this millennium, comes from basically a tiny little passage in the book of Revelation. And that's really it.
Right, and that is Revelation 20.
Revelation 20, verses 1 through 4. So we have 4 little verses in a very strange book that people are creating entire eschatologies out of,
right?
Which to me feels problematic right away. Like you're taking the most confusing book, you're taking 4 little verses. It's not talked about anywhere else, really, in any clear way, in all of the canon, and then you're creating a doctrine around it. that feels strange to me. But as it's talked about in these 4 little verses, the millennium will be a period of peace and justice and prosperity in which Satan is bound. So it's this wonderful 1,000-year period. Now, how the church has interpreted that has varied. And historically, people in different denominations have fallen into one of 3 camps. Okay? So there's the premillennialists, as Kevin has mentioned, we come from, which believes that Jesus will come before the millennium. So that's what premillennium means, is the return of Christ. Jesus is going to come back before the millennium begins. Then there's the post-millennialists who believe that Jesus will come back after the millennium. And then there's the millennialist who essentially believe that we're in it. This is it.
Right.
This is the millennium. So the age of the church is this metaphorical 1,000-year reign.
Right. And if it takes 3,000 years, it doesn't matter. It's basically the millennium. And it's worth noting, we need to mention this, that Newell uses the word millennial. It's even hard for us to say. It's funny. Millenarianism, because that's what Moltmann uses. And we've obviously come from the school of millennialism. So they're basically the same, but he said he uses millenarianism because Moltmann does. I mean, there are some maybe other implications that millenarianism is more socio-political and spiritual, whereas millennialism is just spiritual. Whatever. Millennial is easier to say. So we're going to say millennial, right? Especially if they're basically the same thing. So we just want you to know that they're 2 different words, and Newell uses the other word, but we're going to go with millennial because we're used to saying it and it seems easier to say.
Yeah. So. Yeah, we're trying to keep this as simple as we can for our own sake, really, because, or I'm speaking for myself, like this stuff is still pretty confusing to me, and however I can simplify it for myself, the better. Okay, so Kevin, tell me, out of these 3 camps, out of these 3 views of the millennium, which has historically been the predominant view?
Yeah, millennial.
So that was a shock to me. Again, coming out of a very premillennial background where it just felt like it was the giant monument that we were all bowing down to or something. I was surprised to read that premillennialism is a very recent and kind of narrow, historically, way of looking at things.
Yeah. Well, and the only reason I know that is because, again, what you're saying, all these, the men that sit around and debate dispensationalism, you know, their arch enemies are the covenantal theologians, right? And they're all millennialists. So, which are all basically all the Reformed guys, and you know, historically Augustine, Calvin, all these people. So
part of why that shocked me is because when he was explaining what amillennialism is, which again is we're in the millennium, we're in this 1,000-year age of peace and prosperity and justice, where Satan is bound. I'm like, how can anyone believe that we're in that? When you look around the world,
right,
you're like, this is it. This is the reign of Christ, where of peace and justice and prosperity. When Satan is bound, it doesn't really look like it.
Well, no, but the argument is that this is the result of sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And things would be much worse if Satan wasn't bound.
So, yes, just to put a finer point on it, just to get the scope of historically the folks that have held an amillennial view. We're talking about Roman Catholicism, amillennial. We're talking about Eastern Orthodox, and we're talking about all the magisterial Protestants are amillennial. They see the millennium as symbolically realized now in the church age. Historically, this is the most common interpretation of the Revelation millennium. This interpretation was derived primarily from Augustine, who standardized much of the eschatology of the Western Church in his work, The City of God. Both pre- and post-millennial interpretations have been the minority positions in church history.
That's crazy. Yeah.
So again, just for my sake, Kevin, when we talk about magisterial Protestants, we're talking about all the Reformed churches, right?
Yeah.
Which includes like Presbyterians and
Yeah.
Mhm.
Presbyterians, Lutherans, a lot of the Reformed traditions.
Okay. All right. So let's start with millennialism. This has been called historical millennialism, which for me, that label isn't that helpful. I think that they call it that because they mean it's happening right now in current history. I don't know. So, millennialism, we're going to look into this. And what I love about this chapter is Newell does a really nice job of showing us in history how each of these views have played out and what the effects of these views are on how we show up as the church in the world. So let's get into millennialism, the predominant view throughout history, and where their thinking was, how they got to their view that the church age, their current historical moment, is the millennium. So for Moltmann, the events of the 4th century transformed Christianity from being a persecuted minority into the official religion of the empire and compounded a long process that had already begun in the 2nd century. In this sense, Eusebius of Caesarea, the most famous imperial theologian of this period, understood Constantine as a messianic figure, chosen by God to bring peace and salvation to the peoples of the earth. Constantine had come to complete the work of Augustus and had unified many diverse peoples into the one unity of the empire and had converted it from polytheism to monotheism, that is, from darkness to light. Rome was now seen as the vehicle for salvation in world history, and the emperor was God's chosen regent in the world. The Roman Empire, which had now become Christian, was nothing less than the universal kingdom of Christ. So interesting. So he plugs it right into historical moment.
Right.
So it starts to make sense. If you were a person living around this period and you watched the world go from darkness to light under this emperor, Constantine, you watched the church go from being a persecuted minority to being the official religion.
Right.
You watched the world go from polytheism into monotheistic, and you saw the unification of all these diverse people groups under this one empire. Yeah, I guess it wouldn't be a stretch to start believing like this is the millennium. This is the reign of peace, prosperity, and justice.
Yeah.
That Revelation is talking about.
But also, I would just think as we're talking right now, it just occurred to me that that part of Revelation, when things get upturned, it's very revolutionary. They probably didn't want to foment some kind of revolution, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great point because as I understand it, John in the book of Revelation, if I have taken anything away from my understanding of that book in the Bible, John is critiquing the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
It is a revolutionary book against Rome. And yet here, historically, the Christian church has seen Rome as God's reign on earth.
Right. All right, continuing with Newell. This concept of a holy empire later became a common trope in history, and after first being used by Rome, it was then utilized by Byzantium and later by Moscow. In this imperial theology, Christ already reigned as Pantocrator, and so his earthly viceroy, the emperor, reflected this rule. This conflation of church and state continued even after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, especially in the Eastern Orthodox world, where the Tsar saw himself as the bringer of Christ's reign on earth, and paradoxically even continued under communism, where the Orthodox Church was at times reduced to an appendix of the state. Whereas the early church was based on congregations which grew organically through the preaching of missionaries and the growth of networking of house churches, the later Constantinian imperial church was divided into parishes and geographical areas that reflected the governmental provinces of the empire, and came to be governed through a strict hierarchical system of bishops and priests. This monarchical ordering of the church followed the chain of command: one God, one Christ, and one Peter. Moltmann sees this subordinationism as an implicit denial of the doctrine of the Trinity, which instead of a fellowship of the Spirit promotes a pyramidal view of the church. Moreover, for Moltmann, within the Constantinian church, elements of primitive Christianity remained in the monastic orders, which created a double form of the Christian message, one which lived secluded in poverty, prayer, and contemplation, and the other which resided in the world within the structures of the empire.
Right. One of the things that's interesting to me about this is I don't really know that much about Eastern Orthodoxy and the history within that. But for him to include within this that it wasn't just the Roman Empire that had this theological view that this empire is the millennial reign of Christ on earth. It was also in the Eastern Orthodox Church in Moscow, as he mentioned, the Tsar saw himself as the viceroy of God on earth. And then again, I find it very fascinating, this idea of how this shift within the church, going from the early church, which he describes as like having this organic growth of people opting in to the kingdom of God, that shifted into this hierarchical pyramid scheme of the church, which was just this institution that you were just born into. And so it strips it of all its revolutionary essence, and it strips it of any sincere belief, because you're just born into the empire. You are automatically in it, and you're told where to go to church and who's your priest.
Right.
And
that's very fascinating.
And you can't question them. Yeah, it's...
Well, and also, even if you are not a practicing person of faith, you've got all the culture around you, and this is what we've seen in the world, right?
It becomes a cultural phenomenon,
right,
rather than anything intrinsic that you're choosing for yourself. Okay, so going on from there, with the disintegration of the Roman Empire, right? That's interesting. So if you believe that the Roman Empire is the millennial reign of Christ on earth, how do you process when the Roman Empire crumbles, right? With the disintegration of the Roman Empire during the 5th century, the Pontifex Maximus, the Pope in Rome, began assuming the powers of the emperor. It might be said that the imperium as church in Byzantium turned in Rome into the church as imperium. In this way, the legal and political centralism and hierarchy of the Roman Empire were transposed into the structures, organization, and laws of the Roman Catholic Church, which became Roma Aeterna. So Roman Empire has been brought to its knees. That's okay. The Pope takes over. The Pope is the new emperor. The church is the new empire, and it's eternal. These tendencies can already be seen as early as the writings of Ignatius of Antioch in the 2nd century and reach their highest point in the First Vatican Council in 1868.
Wow.
For Moltmann, this entire history and system of realized millennialism led to the inevitable use of violence and coercion. So we're going to have the reign of Christ, and we're going to make sure we get there through the use of violence and coercion, and was the presumptuous and premature fulfillment of the Messianic promises of the Bible.
Wow. Yeah, but that's just crazy, because I feel like that allows states to justify any kind of violence
The
right?
church
The
even
church, right.
to justify any kind of violence.
But the fact that the church and state are
Yeah.
combined, which in our country, we right out of the gate in our Constitution, that was one of the first things we said is a separation of the two, because we've seen these abuses. Very interesting. Continuing on with Newell. In contrast to ecclesiastical millennialism, Moltmann sees one of the greatest examples of political millennialism not only in the many European empires in history, but especially in the political project of the United States. For Moltmann, the Messianic mission of America was forged initially through the theology of the Puritans who came to North America in the 17th century and brought with them their concepts of predestination and election. The Puritans saw themselves as the new Israel and as pilgrims in a new Exodus in which they had to fight the battles of the Lord against the forces of evil. Together with Enlightenment ideas of progress and liberty, these concepts help to give America its identity as a chosen nation and its manifest destiny of bringing freedom and democracy to the world, as well as the God-given task of smiting its enemies. America is a great experiment founded upon millennial and messianic ideas. American democracy remains incomplete until the whole world has been won for democracy. That makes this political experiment a messianic experiment.
That is so interesting. So here we are looking at people of the Constantinian shift that saw the emperor as God's viceroy, bringing in this millennial period of peace and prosperity and justice, and Satan is bound. And then he turns it and says, well, that's exactly the mindset of the early European Americans. This American project was this belief by these Europeans that they were the new Israel, they were here to fight God's enemies, and they're going to bring the reign of Christ onto the earth. So America is this amillennial project, this manifest destiny. And yeah, again, it justifies the use of violence, onward Christian soldiers, etc. Around these messianic and millennial ideas were developed a whole series of rites and special days that helped to form what Robert Bellah described as America's civil religion. These go from Memorial Day and Thanksgiving to the remembrance of great American heroes. Whereas ecclesiastical millennialism sees the church as the millennial realization of the kingdom of God, this form of political millennialism sees the state as the millennial fulfillment in history. And to finish up this section on millennialism, he writes, the discovery and conquest of the Americas on the part of European empires, the amazing advancements in technology, the domination of nature, and a new faith in reason are all historical events which form the context of modern amillennialism. Again, you understand when you look at it that way that they really believed that God was doing something through them. And it was all these things coming together. The conquest of a brand new world in their eyes by settling in the new world. There's all these advancements and developments in technology going on. And then they believed that they saw that we as humans have all this power to exploit and dominate nature. So that's part of their theology, that it's right for humans to exploit and dominate nature. And then the Enlightenment, this new faith in reason, that we are so superior. These all culminate, they all come together and culminate into this belief that we are ushering in the age of Christ on the earth. All right, so that is our summary for now of the amillennial point of view.
And I think it's worth mentioning the just like with atheism, agnosticism, the in front of the millennial means there is no millennialism.
Which is misleading.
Or millennium, yes.
I think maybe a better way to say it, there is no future millennium because the millennium is right now. We are the millennium.
Right.
So it's, again, sometimes I don't find these labels completely helpful.
Right.
Or they are at least somewhat confusing. But
right. And as you can imagine, like hermeneutically, you can do whatever you want with that because it's no period of time. It's you decide The powers that be decide when it starts, when it ends, how long it lasts.
Who the heroes are.
Yeah, who the heroes are.
Who the devils are.
Right.
Okay, well, who are the post-millennialists and what was their belief? So I was very interested to learn. So again, post-millennial means Jesus is returning after a millennial period of peace, prosperity, and justice where Satan is bound. So if you believe that, what that means and what Newell brings out is that you have a very optimistic view of the church's role.
And of humanity.
And of humanity, because you believe that we play a very big role, important role, in bringing about this age of peace, justice, and prosperity before Jesus comes back. Our role is to make the world a better place.
Right.
So you have this optimism.
And you can see when, I just want to say, because it came up for me, when we talk about the already not yet, and hey, the new age has already started and it's our job to like push it forward, it could seem that, oh, that fits nicely with postmillennialism, right? It could just seem that way. But I think what we've found, or what we'll see with a lot of postmillennial theology, not all, but a lot of it, he does mention, I think, is in this chapter, the last chapter, where he talks about a humanistic messianism.
Yeah, his last
versus a messianic humanism.
That was around liberation.
Right. And the idea there is that maybe humans start turning God's program into a socio-political program.
Right.
And they start taking over and doing things that they weren't meant to do, or that kind of thing. And so the social gospel, for instance.
Yeah, which we are about to talk about. So again, postmillennialism has an optimistic outlook on history and holds that the church's efforts in the present age will completely transform the world to the extent of allowing God's kingdom to be established. So our efforts are going to help allow God's kingdom to be established on earth before the return of Christ. So I think I know what you're saying. In some ways, it could overlap on some level with amillennialism, right? Amillennialism believes this is the kingdom of God on earth. This human institution, this human structure, this human empire is God's kingdom on earth. Whereas a post-millennialism is saying, let's work to transform the world so that Christ can come back.
Right.
Right. Now, of course, as we've mentioned, but now we're kind of attaching it to this post-millennial optimism, this optimism was curtailed after the 2 world wars.
Right.
So human history has a way of dampening optimism.
Yeah. Right. And today there are some post-millennial theologians, but there are few. I mean, just out of the gate, right? There was a guy named Greg Banson. I think I mentioned this before. He's passed away, but Ken Gentry is an example if you were interested. But there are just very few post-millennials.
He begins with Walter Rauschenbusch. And the time period we're talking about here is, for example, Walter Rauschenbusch lived from 1861 to 1918. So we're talking about 19th century. And Rauschenbusch is in the North American context. And I believe he is the father, if you will, of the social gospel.
Yeah.
So he would fit into this optimistic camp of believing that humans are here to improve the world and we can create this millennial period before the return of Christ.
And it's worth noting, some may not know this, but that whole question of what would Jesus do, that came out of the social gospel. We resurrected that question, what would Jesus do, to try and motivate us to do good, I suppose. Newell says, like Moltmann, Rauschenbusch also underlined the centrality of eschatology in early Christianity. And this is quoting Rauschenbusch. Religion is always eschatological. Its characteristic is faith. It lives in and for the future. In primitive Christianity, eschatology was in the center of religious interest and thought.
Religion is always eschatological. It's always wondering about our ultimate destiny.
Right. And I mean, that is kind of true, right? I mean, even I feel like this podcast, how many times do we say, we know what the future is going to be, we know what the values of the future eternal state are going to be, or the final age, however you want to say it, the eschaton. We know what those values are, so let's start living them now. I mean, we say things like that, and that's eschatological.
Yeah, and it reminds me of how Newell started this paper by quoting Bloch, who said, "Where there is religion, there is hope." Like, that's the whole point.
Right.
It's a human saying, what is this all for?
Right.
Where are we going? What am I supposed to be doing? Where there is religion, there is hope. And Rauschenbusch says, where there is religion, there is eschatology, basically. There's a quest, there's a wondering about what the destiny of all this is.
There's a goal, right? Yeah. I mean, it attempts to answer the ultimate reality questions for humans. Mm-hmm. So,
Marcello highlights 3 post-millennial theologians in history and how Moltmann resonated in many ways with these 3, not in every way, as we'll see, but in some ways. So the 3 post-millennial theologians we're going to look at are John Wesley, Charles Finney, and Booth. I can't remember at the top of my head what his first name was. So let's start with John Wesley. And like right away, as I started reading about John Wesley and what a super stud he was, in my opinion, and I remember turning to Kevin and saying, yeah, at Moody Bible Institute, I don't remember learning much at all about John Wesley. And now I'm kind of understanding why. I didn't know, as I applied to be a student at Moody Bible Institute, I didn't know anything about dispensationalism and premillennialism, and that was this school I was signing up for, or that was a line of thought I was signing up for. But yeah, we definitely got a very curated, chosen, of course, as any institution does.
Right.
They choose what they're going to teach you and what they're going to leave out. It was very fun to learn a little bit about John Wesley.
All right, quoting from Newell. The revivalist and theologian John Wesley, he lived from 1703 to 1791, in particular emphasized both personal salvation and social reform, and campaigned for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, whereas Lutheranism and Protestantism more generally had underlined the salvific nature of faith. Wesley built upon this foundation but focused on sanctification. For Wesley, holiness of heart and life were the nucleus of the Christian message, as opposed to justification in Luther. That's fascinating.
That's fascinating because, like, how would you put that in your own words?
Well, I mean, just even last night at our Lenten supper, we were talking about PSA, penal substitutionary atonement, and just God's wrath and justification and all that.
The whole point is we're terrible sinners.
Right.
God can't stand us. God saved us through Jesus, or Jesus saved us from God.
Right.
In the worst way of looking at PSA. And now we get to go to heaven, and that's it. End of story.
Right.
Whereas Wesley's coming in saying, no, it's not just about personal salvation. It's about how we show up on this planet and how we live. Right.
And it's worth noting, I learned this because I did learn a little about Wesley at Moody because I took a history of doctrine class, but that Wesley actually believed that a human and that he himself could become 100% sanctified on this earth.
Yeah, and again, that doesn't raise my ire. I feel like that was exaggerated in our school in terms of like, isn't that crazy? To me, I think that, I don't know, I look at it in a softer way.
Because when I read that, I think about myself. Can you imagine me 100% sanctified?
Of course I can.
On this earth?
Of course I can.
A lot of work to do.
Where there is faith, there is hope, right?
Oh my God. I just think, it sounds almost impossible, but I suppose that's like reaching enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least there are moments where we reach oneness with God, I would say.
Yeah, moments.
Yeah, and we can practice those moments.
Yeah.
And celebrate those moments. Okay.
And expand those moments.
Okay, so moving on here. Methodism, which grew out of Wesley's teachings, was particularly adapted to the industrial society which had developed in Great Britain. So was John Wesley in Great Britain?
Well, he was British, yeah.
And okay.
And he had a brother who he worked with, Charles.
Yeah. So Methodism is adapted to this industrial society which is occurring in Great Britain, and a proletariat which lived in very poor conditions in the newly formed urban centers. Methodism grew rapidly as it preached a message of salvation, self-discipline, and cleanliness of life, which empowered the poor to reorganize their lives and gave them spiritual direction, worth, community within their context of urban alienation and poverty. Methodists created numerous benevolent societies that advocated for a vast array of social changes, such as relief for the poor, prison reform, the end of child labor, abolition of slavery, temperance, the opening of orphanages, houses for battered women, improvement of conditions for minors, worker societies, as well as numerous educational institutions and schools.
He did a lot.
It makes you feel proud that the church has done good in this world.
Right.
And here's an example of a person who started a movement that did this much good in the world.
Yeah. I'm going to read more from Newell here. Methodism also had an important role in influencing the development of the Labour Party in Britain, with many of its initial leaders being Methodists. Wesley described these efforts as social holiness and saw them as central to his preaching and theology, quoting, "The gospel of Christ knows of no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness."
Wow.
Wesley's views on eschatology were generally post-millennial and fairly optimistic. For the founder of Methodism, the kingdom of God would grow incrementally further and further in the world, reforming every form of evil and selfishness, after which Christ himself would return and the earth would be transformed into a utopia beyond all death and sin. In the interim period between the present and the parousia,
The second coming.
humanity and God should work synergistically by building the kingdom of God on earth. That's interesting, though, that at least he's saying that Christ will transform this world.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, he's going to return and the earth will be transformed into a utopia beyond all death and sin.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm reading this, and the more as we go on here, the more you read about Wesley, I'm feeling like, wow, he kind of has a vegan theology.
Yeah.
In fact, in his famous sermon called The Great Deliverance, which Wesley preached in 1781, John Wesley highlighted the Christian hope for the deliverance of the entire created order, including the animal kingdom, from the violence and futility it is presently enslaved to. Wesley envisioned a future of complete cosmic redemption in which all creation would live in harmony and peace. So this is where I'm thinking, like, yeah, Wesley was a great guy.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the second post-millennial theologian that Newell's going to highlight, who is Charles Finney. So in the North American context, and influenced in part by John Wesley, the so-called Second Great Awakening, which occurred from 1790 to 1840, wow, also promoted a similar theological vision, which resonates with Moltmann's theology of hope and Tikkun Olam. So Charles Finney lived from 1792 to 1875, was perhaps the most important revivalist and preacher of this period, and also promoted a series of reforms that went side by side with his aggressive evangelism. Finney, like Wesley, believed that a very high level of holiness could be achieved in this life. Finney's post-millennial eschatology meant that the church had the task of reforming the whole world in order to bring the kingdom of God on earth, and every Christian was therefore a reformer.
All right, quoting Finney, "Now the great business of the church is to reform the world, to put away every kind of sin. The Church of Christ was originally organized to be a body of reformers. The very profession of Christianity implies the profession and virtually an oath to do all that can be done for the universal reformation of the world. The Christian church was designed to make aggressive movements in every direction, to reform individuals, communities, and governments, and never rest until the kingdom and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High God.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. He sounds like a revolutionary.
Yeah.
Aggressive movements.
Yeah. So he believed in the reformation of mankind, championed a spectrum of social reforms ranging from the abolition of slavery to temperance and dietetic reform. And I don't think Marcello expounds on Finney's dietetic reform, but I did look it up, and guess what?
He's vegan. He's vegetarian.
Well, among other things, yeah, he said no flesh.
Wow.
I mean, did you ever know that about Charles Finney?
No.
That he was preaching a diet of no flesh. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And speaking of this post-millennial optimism for all of creation that we see running through Wesley, Finney, we also have William Booth. It's William Booth. William Booth is mentioned here in this context. William Booth living from 1829 to 1912. Do you know what William Booth founded? What organization?
The Salvation Army?
Yes, the Salvation Army. He and his wife were both vegetarians. And in fact, his wife is quoted as saying, "Eat like a Christian."
Wow. We should bring that back.
Yeah. So William Booth, originally a Methodist, continued the revivalist and social legacy of Methodism in Great Britain and internationally through the founding of the Salvation Army. So Newell writes, and this is important, while it is possible to accuse both Wesley and Finney of excessive optimism, much like Rauschenbusch's social gospel, it must be remembered that their theology and reform efforts were birthed in particularly difficult circumstances. And despite huge odds arrayed against them, their optimism appears to be more based on their faith in the power of the Christian message and perhaps the transformability of the world than in an underestimation of the brokenness and injustice within it. So I think that's always important to come back to. People who choose hope, it's not that they underestimate how evil the world is, how broken the world is, right?
Right.
Because a lot of the most hopeful theologians we have in history came out of horrific conditions.
Yeah.
It's not that they underestimate evil, it's that they give full hope and full estimation, if you will, to the power of the Christian message, the power of the resurrection, and the transformability of the world, of what God's doing, God's plan, God's dream
Right.
of redeeming the world.
Well, I think sometimes, at least how I'm feeling lately, is when things are so dire, they're beyond human capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're kind of left with the idea that God save us, right? We can't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like if you're someone who is opposing the institution of slavery, for example, of human slavery, right? I'm sure it felt like a daunting, that's not even enough of a word. It felt like an insurmountable institution that will never go away. It's so embedded. All the powerful are protecting it.
Right. It's part of the economy. I mean, that's kind of like thinking about today.
Yeah. But to have hope that God is about ending this evil and that we need to play a role in that.
Right.
While post-millennial revivalism tended to eschew the idea of violence, of revolutionary violence, this is how they believed one could transform the world. They believed that preaching, teaching, personal Christian ethics, social programs, political activism, and influence were the main means of transforming the world. So they didn't see themselves as needing to bring about God's kingdom through coercion and violence. So that would be another distinction between post-millennial thinking and amillennial thinking. So we would be remiss not to also mention how Moltmann differed from Wesley and Finney.
Hmm.
So they resonated in many, many, many ways, as we've been looking at, but there was one major point on which they separated. And that was basically that they had these open air preaching, mass gatherings, and what they would tend to focus on, they would present their listeners with the need for immediate repentance in order to escape God's imminent judgment. So Moltmann is theologically distant from this fire and brimstone preaching of revivalism. So that was one of the things that came along with this revivalism, was they were trying to motivate people to get on board with the fear of eternal conscious torment because God is so full of wrath.
Right. Quoting a footnote in Newell, he's talking about Moltmann. He directly criticizes this form of evangelicalism in his book, In the End, the Beginning. The image of the God who judges in wrath has caused a great deal of spiritual damage. The approach of the Last Judgment was always a threatening message used by the church and some evangelists, and poisoned the idea of God in the soul. It plunged the one into profound self-doubt and roused the other to an outraged rejection of any belief in God at all. One can also speculate that Moltmann's embrace of universalism may have influenced his view of evangelization.
Yeah, so I agree with Moltmann, obviously, that this emphasis on this judging, wrathful God has done incredible spiritual damage. Can you relate to that? Like, it plunges a person into self-doubt.
Right.
And
it's like being coerced. It's like being held by the police and interrogated or tortured, waterboarded. Like, what are you going to say? You're going to say what you need to say to make it stop.
And I mean, growing up in a church like that, preachers will say that if you have any shadow of a doubt that you're not saved from hell, come down here this morning and get saved.
Right.
And you see the little kids coming down week after week after week after week, right? Because they're so scared of God.
Well, yeah, it's a very Baptist tradition, right?
Yeah. So in contrast to that, Moltmann's theology tends to focus on themes of hope, love, God's solidarity with those who are suffering, and ecology. All right, so to recap so far, all millennialists believe that the human institutions of empire and church are the age of
the millennium.
Thank you. Yes. And they are not afraid to use violence and coercion to get you to get in line with it. Post-millennialism, believing that Christ will return after the millennium, believe that we are playing a very large role in bringing about the millennium by transforming the world, making the world a better place, and standing in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. Okay. So post-millennialism is very optimistic about what we can do. So with that in mind, premillennialism, let's turn to that. The theology that we were brought up in.
Yeah.
They believe that Christ will come before any millennium. And that belief lends itself to a pessimism in terms of what we can and should and are expected to do.
But also about this earth, about creation itself.
Precisely. So in its worst form and in its commonly manifested form, premillennialism rejoices in seeing humanity defeated and collapsing, and in seeing the world defeated and collapsing. As for them, this means that God's salvation is drawing close. So premillennialism is actively opposed to the salvation of the social order before the return of Christ, as this is seen as both useless and contrary to God's will.
So we sit on our hands, basically.
And rejoice when we see evil winning, when we see destruction, when we see war, when we see genocide, when we see famine, when we see plague.
Right, because all of this leads to, wow, Christ is coming back soon, right?
Yeah.
The worse it gets, the sooner Christ will return.
Yeah. So don't enter into those situations and try to stop them or ameliorate them or help in any way. I mean, like, this makes me shiver and shake inside. This is so upsetting.
Right.
That is so ugly.
Right.
But that is what we come out of, that the more the oceans are polluted, the more species go extinct, the more you can't swim in the rivers because they're so disgusting, or
Right.
the more the soil can't bear any harvest. We should rejoice.
Right.
That means that Christ is going to come back and save us, and so we can escape out of here.
Right. I think it's probably one of the biggest things I got out of this chapter, because we obviously were born and bred into a premillennial dispensational eschatology, but this idea that Newell brings up here, that premillennialism is very pessimistic about creation, I guess I hadn't thought of it that way. And so to read it and then consider it, I was like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Because we're escaping out of this hellhole, right?
Yeah. Instead of remembering that God called this creation very good,
right,
and lovingly created it, we're calling it a hellhole now, that God's going to help us escape. Yeah, as I was reading it similarly, I was thinking, oh, so this is where this comes from. And again, as vegan theologians, we need to understand where this comes from. It informs what we're up against. It shows us, like, oh, this is what we need to address.
Right. 100%.
All right, so let's discuss how premillennial thought became a thing, where it came from. So according to Moltmann, basically up until the French Revolution, the Messianism that was dominant in the pietistic movement was open to the world and oriented towards a positive future. But after historical events like the French Revolution, premillennialism became conservative and anti-modernist and went on to influence the apocalyptic speculations of dispensationalist fundamentalism. Dispensationalism, which became the promoter of this modern, pessimistic premillennialism, was then popularized in Britain and the United States during the 19th century by the Irish preacher John Darby, C.I. Scofield with his famous study Bible, and the evangelist D.L. Moody.
Yeah, that's our guy.
God bless the school that D.L. Moody founded. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like, so that's our inheritance that we got, was basically a very pessimistic premillennialism. Dispensationalism inserted itself within the vacuum created after the American Civil War and the ensuing post-war pessimism regarding society and humanity. The gradual eclipse of the dream of a liberal commonwealth of self-governing communities saw the concomitant rise of the power of the federal government and large stockholding corporations. These sentiments were then exacerbated during the course of the 20th century and the two world wars, and according to Northcott, found even more fertile ground in the sharp rise in social inequality of the Reagan years.
Quoting from Newell, in the 20th century, dispensationalism was then disseminated worldwide through prophecy conferences, theological seminaries, example, Dallas Theological Seminary. And many of our professors, I think in the entire theology department, were from Dallas Theological Seminary at Moody, and various evangelical denominations. At a popular level, one of the main conduits of the spread of dispensationalism was the book by Hal Lindsey, The Late Great Planet Earth, came out in 1970, one of the bestsellers of the 1970s, and later Left Behind, 1995 series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, which also sold tens of millions of copies. In this eschatology before the final Armageddon and the worst period of the end times, believers would be delivered from the earth via the rapture. During the course of the 20th century, this apocalyptic eschatology was wed to the conservative politics of the religious right in the United States. All of these factors helped to promulgate worldwide an apocalyptic eschatology in which the earth would soon be destroyed, and only believers would be delivered from the coming catastrophe. For Moltmann, the optimistic, pietistic millennialism, which was hopeful and attempted to heal and better the world, was replaced by a fearful and reactionary politics. The historical involvement in resistance there, millennial pietism, is paralleled here by the apocalyptic flight from the world.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that while we were at Moody, Jerry Jenkins was the writer in residence there. And Moody Press, which published a lot of books, I think their mission was to make up any slack that Moody didn't get in donations because it was tuition free. So they were helping to pay for the tuition. But I know that Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye presented their Left Behind series to Moody Press, and Moody Press turned it down for some reason, which I don't know why, but which is interesting, right? Dispensational school. And then Tyndale picked it up, which is in Wheaton. And
wow,
they ran with it. And of course, it made
millions.
It made millions. So it's just funny that Moody Press turned it
Well,
down.
that gives me a little more respect for Moody. For whatever reasons, they saw that they didn't want to sell their souls in that way.
Right. And we also know some other inside stuff, which maybe we shouldn't say, but we know professor that talked to Jerry Jenkins, and he even said, he admitted, yeah, this isn't my best writing.
Yeah.
And so that's just crazy, right? You think you'd want to further the kingdom with your best.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that came up for me as we were reading that section is, so many times when you come across people who have walked away from the faith, who were brought up in Christianity and have walked away from the church, and when they critique their understanding of the theology they were given, right, which is this wrathful God who killed his own son, and you have to believe or you're going to go to eternal conscious torment, and also a God who doesn't care about this world, and we're just supposed to escape this world to go somewhere else. I was just thinking, like, this is the theology that so many people have walked away from. And it's a misrepresentation of God. And yet that's what they think the church is.
Right. Well, the other thing that stood out to me, I hadn't thought of it this way again, thank you, Marcello Newell, but where he says that for Moltmann, the optimistic, pietistic millennialism which was hopeful and attempted to heal and better the world, was replaced by a fearful and reactionary politics. And interestingly, the idea of reactionary politics, that's like fascism. That's like the KKK. Those are reactionary politics. And they're very conservative politics. So it's just interesting that you've got this force of people that don't want things to change and progress and get better, and that they will use violence to maintain the status quo of their conservatism, is how I see this, is how I read this.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's bothersome, right? That this theology is attached to some reactionary politics.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. So I found, as I said, the historical laying out of how these three views play out in history, I found all of that extremely interesting. So for me, that was one of the biggest takeaways in terms of how to view our vegan theology in light of those three ways of seeing eschatology, I guess. Now, Marcello Newell's primary point, his thesis, I think, in discussing all of this, is he wants to point out that Moltmann's theology project, Moltmann's eschatology, his theology of hope and a belief in tikkun olam, that we can repair the world, positions Moltmann in a very unique place. His eschatology, as Newell points out, doesn't neatly fit within any of these three traditions. And Moltmann's theology of hope leads him to an original eschatology, one that doesn't really fit any of what we've discussed. Newell calls Moltmann's theology Messianic millennialism, and we'll look into some of why that is. And a lot of it is kind of what we've been discussing all along.
Right.
With where Moltmann saw our relationship in terms of our ultimate destiny and what our role is now.
Quoting from Newell, Moltmann's emphasis both on hope and on the idea of tikkun olam also helped to shield his theology from an over-realized eschatology, which sees present ecclesiastical, historical, and political configurations as the final kingdom of God. In this eschatology, the world is neither a vale of tears to be escaped, nor the kingdom of God in its fullness, but a broken world which is open to hope. It can also be said that while premillennialism has been prone to the Gnostic tendency of the flight from the world, and we talked about that in his chapter 5, historical millennialism has at times tended towards an uncritical acceptance of certain aspects of the past or present, be they a certain historical epoch, a country, empire, or a specific expression of the church, which are viewed as ideal expressions of the millennial kingdom on earth. This over-realized eschatology has been used to justify use of authoritarianism and violence in the pursuit of its millennial goals. On the other hand, for Moltmann and his retrieval of tikkun olam and what he terms eschatological millennialism, the kingdom remains outstanding in the present age and can only be proleptically anticipated, but cannot be enforced through mere human effort. For Moltmann, the world is not yet finished, but is understood as engaged in history. It is a world of possibilities, but also an age of diaspora, of sowing and hope, of self-surrender and sacrifice. For it is an age that stands within the horizon of a new future. The journeying nature of Moltmann's Messianic project also means that it can never fully ally itself with any specific political party, group, country, movement, empire, or institution, but is always on its way to its future, which it expects from God and his coming.
That last sentiment right there, he had this really healthy reservation about fully attaching yourself to a person or a movement or an organization.
Right.
Like he was willing to see the good in those and to see the value of what they're doing in the world and to join them in that good, but don't get so attached to them that if and when they start to disappoint and go off mission or whatever, that you're devastated.
Right.
Moltmann's eschatology is based on the dialectic of the cross and the resurrection and avoids both the triumphalism and violence of Constantinian amillennialism and political post-millennialism, but also the apocalyptic flight from the world and pessimism of premillennialism. Furthermore, it overcomes the problem of an otherworldly eschaton, not through a literal earthly millennium and later more spiritual future age, but by seeing the new creation as the future of the very earth on which Christ's cross stands and which has been redeemed and transformed. So he's seeing the future spiritual age as a new creation of this very earth, this very soil where the cross stood is the place of our future.
Right. Which speaks to history and how important history is. We've talked about this, but...
No, it's good to talk about it again. I mean, to keep coming back to that.
Right. Because God promises an embodied future.
Yes.
And Christ's cross, death, and then resurrection were real physical realities on this earth, and that speaks to our future and what it will be like. It will be an embodied future on this earth.
Yeah. So what we do in human history matters forever.
Right.
And for Moltmann, the end of the ages, we're not just bringing back the original creation, but God is going to do something greater than what was created at the beginning. Like it's going to be even more fulfilled, which is really beautiful too.
Right. Quoting Newell, on numerous occasions, Moltmann underlines how hope in the resurrection must bring about solidarity with the earth and its creatures, as it hopes for their redemption. He must, in obedience, seek the divine righteousness in his body, on earth, and in all creatures. Further, Moltmann says, but eschatology is nothing other than faith in the Creator with its eyes turned towards the future. Anyone who believes in the God who created being out of nothing also believes in the God who gives life to the dead. This means that he hopes for the new creation of heaven and earth.
Yes. So as Newell begins to bring his theses to a close, I really liked what he says here. He says, if eschatology's goal is to repair the world, the main translation I have favored in this thesis. This immediately communicates various important points. Firstly, that this world and its redemption are a central concern of eschatology, as opposed to an otherworldly salvation of the spirit. Secondly, that the world is broken and in need of repair. Thirdly, that the world can be repaired. And fourthly, that this repair is desirable. Fifthly, that God in his saving purposes relates to humanity with the concrete world of history and nature. And I mean, I would say that we resonate with every single one of those points, and that's what we're trying to get across. Because not every Christian, not every theology, not every denomination is brought up believing those points.
Right.
Namely that, like he started out, eschatology's goal is to repair God's world.
Right.
This paradigm of Moltmann's breaks free from both the conservatism or quietism of religious traditionalism and its seeking of a past golden age. It also refuses to be ever fully accommodated to the present, enmeshed as it is in brokenness, injustice, and death. I love how Newell always brings us back to Moltmann's emphasis on the resurrection, that is what everything is based on, especially our hope. The resurrection is why we have hope. Moltmann highlights how Christian faith understands itself as faithfulness to hope as it is mindful of the resurrection of Christ, and as faithfulness to the earth as it is mindful of the cross of Christ. So let me read that again. Moltmann says Christian faith understands itself as faithfulness to hope as it is mindful of the resurrection of Christ, and as faithfulness to the earth as it is mindful of the cross of Christ. So our hope is because we remember the resurrection. Our faithfulness to the earth is because we remember the cross of Christ. It just reminds me of what we pray every Sunday at our church and at churches around the world. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is what we're praying for. So this chapter specifically helped me have a better handle on some of the things as vegan theologians we need to be aware of, whether we're talking with maybe a Roman Catholic who believes that the church is the unquestionable age of Christ, right? And or whether we're talking to more of a post-millennial idea of the wrath of God, that we have to escape God's wrath, or whether we're talking about a very pessimistic premillennial perspective. I mean, there are things that we now can be more informed to address as vegan theologians. And I mean, Newell does such a beautiful job throughout this at really looking at Moltmann's trajectory in his theological project and his theology of hope, so rooted in the resurrection and also rooted in a belief in this creation, that God is not abandoning it.
Right.
And God's dream and God's project is to redeem it. And so, yeah, he makes a very compelling case that Moltmann's eschatology is unique from these others. And I would definitely say, as it's laid out for us here, that we would resonate, as vegan theologians, our theology really resonates with this idea of tikkun olam. Our job as humans is to do everything we can to resist evil and to repair this world, all of creation, every species, every nook and cranny of it.
Right. Yeah, and if you want to read more about Moltmann's eschatology, which he refers to as Messianic millennialism, you can read his book, The Coming of God, Christian Eschatology, and maybe if we get questions, we can dive deeper at some point. Also, if you just want to get a copy of this thesis, you could probably reach out to us or Moltmann himself, or Newell himself, or we could connect you with him if you need help with that. But if you're just curious and you want to figure out more of this vegan theology, maybe a vegan eschatology, something like that, we can try to help you with that. Anyway, thanks for listening. Really appreciate you bearing with this eschatology discussion.
Yeah. Hopefully it was more enlightening than it was befuddling. Anyway, thank
All
you,
right.
everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Peace.